For historical context and more information, see the description below.
A few years ago, Carl Sanders, then the governor of Georgia, was asked what he thought was the great moral problem confronting this nation. His reply was that the United States was founded upon a faith in God, and it grew great in the adherence of the American people to his commandments. Our salvation as a nation and as a people lies in a renewal of that faith and a rededication to those commandments. Until this is accomplished, we can expect immorality in our country, already rampant enough, to continue on its destructive path. End of quote. Now, of course, the first part of that quotation is highly inaccurate. This nation has never adhered to the commandments of God, nor has any nation, including the people of Israel, to whom the commandments were originally given. But the warning is still very appropriate, very contemporary. We have not been giving thought to them, and there has been a growing immorality, a growing disrespect for law. Is it any wonder that a college student said to his chaplain, "Nobody knows what's right these days. Who's to tell? What difference does it make what you do? All you can do is guess what's right." And those of us who are making a fuss on the campus may be just as right as those who are trying to quell our little riots, for all we know. Well, we ought to be able to do more than guess. And surely the laws of God, as outlined to us in the Bible, are to help us to do more than guess. The people of Israel had a very deep reverence, of course, for them. You recall how sacred was the Ark of the Covenant. It originated in Sinai, and it was carried by the Hebrew people into Canaan. The materials of which it was made were principally acacia wood, hammered gold. On the lid there were two seraphim, and there were golden rings at the four corners that one might take hold of and carry them. Many stories gathered around the significance of the Ark of the Covenant. On one occasion, you remember, the Philistines captured it, and immediately so much trouble came to them that they got rid of it as soon as they could. And so sacred were the laws of God that we're told in the 10th chapter of Deuteronomy that these laws were placed within this Ark of the Covenant. That was the sacredness with which the people of Israel looked upon them. "I will write," it says, "on the table the words that were in the first tables which thou breakest, and thou shalt put them in the ark." So it's natural then in this first psalm, when the psalmist is speaking of the happiness of the godly, to read the words, "But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night." Now, what was the law? Certainly a great deal more than the 10 Commandments in detail. The people of Israel seem to have something of the same feeling that our own people have in Washington if they will turn out a sufficient quantity of law that from the quantity is going to come justice. But of course it doesn't work that way. It didn't work that way for them, and it's not working that way for us. But the commandments, as far as they were concerned, covered the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and all that would appear to be the touching of the mind of God on the mind of man, all that would interpret our obligations as we live one with the other. These they tried to put into their commandments. These, they said, are the laws of God. And the Ten Commandments are the best summary that we have of them. The Ten Commandments that have been the anvils that have broken so many hammers. There's nothing old-fashioned about them. Every person, from the beginning of time, has had to some time or other pass by Mount Sinai. Usually all through our lives we are confronted with problems that make us to know that there is something to which Sinai speaks. All of us, sometime or other, come face to face with Mount Sinai and with the Ten Commandments. Nothing old-fashioned there. There is that which is as contemporary as the morning newspaper, and something that is much more eternal. It's when we fail to recognize this that we become our own moral judges. It's when we fail to recognize this that we find ourselves saying with the student, who is to know? We have no fixed stars, nothing that is going to be the thing to which we can revert and can use as our standard of judgment. And it's then that you find people that are speaking of policemen as pigs, multitudes who refuse to surrender to principle. They indulge in fraud, in embezzlement, sexual perversion. They confuse license and liberty, and they try to forget the whole business with an overindulgence in alcohol or with the use of drugs. And all of these are too evident in this day in which we live. All of these so evident in this day in which we live that it makes the Ten Commandments especially contemporary. That probably more than anything else as a people, we need to go back and try to think through prayerfully what they were saying to us. First, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Luther said, whatever thy heart clings to and relies upon, that's properly thy God. Whether it's popularity, the seeking after money, the seeking after position, whatever the heart relies upon, whatever is the thing that most of all is important to you, that is your God. And the first commandment says, thou shalt have no other God before me. The second, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. A protest against man-made gods, of which there were plenty in the days of Israel, of which we have plenty in our own time. Third, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. This was originally intended to safeguard the oath, but it also concludes any careless or blasphemous use of God's name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The Hebrew people were people who had a habit of setting off some segment and saying, this belongs to God. So it was that they had one nation, Israel, that was holy. One tribe, the Levites, that were of the priestly caste. One building, the Temple at Jerusalem, that was especially dedicated to the worship of God. The first portion of all of one's increase, this was to go to God. So it was natural that when they looked upon their week, they should say, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Set aside one segment and dedicate it to God. Honor thy father and thy mother, for thus will one add solidarity to the family, and thus will one glorify God. The fathers and mothers must remember that first of all they must be worthy of being honored. Sixth, thou shalt not kill. Respect for human life, it has grown with the years, but there are still so many ways of killing people, and we're still seeking respectable names for old-fashioned murder. Every time that we go to war, every time we enforce capital punishment, every time that people die from neglect, this commandment comes back to trouble us with a demand that we are quite sure that up to this point in history we have not satisfied. That we're still guilty of killing. Call it what we may. Thou shalt not commit adultery, the assertion of the sanctity of the marriage tie. Thou shalt not steal, and of course there are many ways of stealing other than just picking up a pair of stockings from a counter. Maybe we shouldn't mention it so close to the income tax season. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Slandering with our tongues can be such cruel business. Probably it will help us to know when we are breaking this commandment if we remember that what we see in other men, what we draw out of them, what we say of them is often a very telling indication of what we are. And if we remember that very frequently the fault that is most in us is the fault that we see first of all in the other person. Thou shalt not covet anything that is in thy neighbor, that is thy neighbor's. Jesus summed it all up by saying, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, and thy neighbor as thyself. The psalmist didn't know, of course, these statements of Jesus, but we may be pretty sure that he was well acquainted with the laws of God as they appeared in the Old Testament. And he said that the man is blessed who meditates upon them. Why? Well, for one thing, the commandments of God can be likened to fixed stars in a moral and a spiritual firmament. So much of what we experience is here today and it is gone tomorrow. But what eternal stuff that there must have been in those commandments, that they've survived the fickleness of man's mind through all of these centuries. And what a foundation they've given us for law. The civil law of pagan Rome underlies all Western jurisprudence, and it was influenced by the basic moral Mosaic law. Our Western attitude towards sexual morality came almost entirely from the law of Moses. The hinges of all that are in the Ten Commandments are hinges of so much of the law of our own day. Elton Trueblood has said, each of the commandments can be greatly expanded. Each can be stated in positive rather than negative form, and they ought to be so stated. When this is done, what we have is not an outworn set of specific prohibitions, but positive principles of such a nature that a good society cannot be constructed or reconstructed without them. So when we meditate on the laws of God, we're meditating upon things that are eternal. I suppose it's a long time since most of us read Kipling's Kim. It's an intriguing story. The story of a little Irish lad who was an orphan, and he was brought up in India. And the British wanted to make a secret agent of him. They wanted to take him into the Secret Service. And so they were attempting to build into the little fellow the kind of strength and the kind of wisdom that would make him valuable in the Secret Service. They placed him in the home of a hypnotist, knowing that this might be a weapon that someday might be used by an enemy. And this hypnotist thought that he had put him under a spell, and he told Kim, you remember, to pick up an earthen jar and to throw it down. Kim did so, and it broke into many pieces. Then the hypnotist said, look at those pieces, and you will see them coming together again as a whole jar. Now, Kim knew what was happening. He wasn't as far under as the hypnotist thought. And so you remember, he went back to the multiplication table. And he started saying to himself, 2 times 3 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 3 is 12, and so on. And the hypnotist said to him, you see, the whole jar has come together again. And Kim says, no, sir, it's smashed. And that was the end of it. Now you see what the secret was. Young Kim was turning to something that he knew was beyond illusion. He was turning to something that he knew was fact, and he was meditating upon that. Thinking upon the thing that was true, and illusion was not strong enough to overcome it. And so it is so often when we are meditating upon God's law, we can have a similar result. There are so many temptations in this world that would hypnotize us. And we need to have something like these commands of God to go back to and start repeating them to ourselves. I actually had a student a few years ago who came to my study and said that he had been through a very difficult time at school, and that he had been afraid for some time that he was going to weaken. And I tried to think of something that my old minister at home had told me, that when I was in some kind of trouble, to repeat some of the words that I had learned from the Bible. And he said, for the life of me, I couldn't think of anything excepting the 10 Commandments. And I began to repeat them. And probably the Lord had blanked out everything else, he said, because that was the thing that did it for me. I concentrated for a time on these things that God had said were right. And it's a great fixed star in one's firmament. Though the cause of evil prosper, yet 'tis truth alone is strong. Though her portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong, yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. And not only, of course, is there permanence in the law, but there are consequences for disobedience. Probably this is the thing that many have been missing in this day. They seem to think that they can disobey these laws with impunity. They seem to think that it's just about as significant as choosing whether one's going to go by bus or by airplane to New York City. You get there eventually, and there's not too much difference. And they've looked upon the laws of God as something that they can take or they can leave. And they forget that one of the fundamental principles upon which our faith is based, and which history says is true, is that when you go against the fundamental laws of God, you pay. You pay. You remember Harry Emerson Fosdick's favorite story of his father going out on a Saturday morning and turning to his mother and saying, "Tell Harry that he can mow the lawn this morning if he feels like it." And after going a little further, he turned around and he said, "And tell Harry he would better feel like it." This is so true of the commandments. This is so true of the law of God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not covet, and so on. And you would better recognize it. Because if you don't, the price will be paid. Look at the criminal who thought he was going to be able to get away with something. Look at the businessman who has made a fortune. He comes to his later years and he begins to realize that a good deal of that fortune was made by devious means. And he gets a guilty conscience. And the years for which he had been saving and thinking that with all this money he was going to have ease for the rest of his life, he has spent in torment and in trouble. Look at a man like Francis Bacon. What a potential he had. One office after another was given to him. But he tried to defy principle. He tried to defy the rules. And the last part of the life of Francis Bacon is one of the saddest chapters in all of history. Ringing through the Bible, you see, are the words, "Thus saith the Lord." Thus saith the Lord. A man like Hitler wouldn't listen. He said that people to listen to this are just weaklings. And he said that the empire that he was building was going to last for 1,000 years. Well, it barely made a decade, and he himself ended up as ashes in a Berlin bunker. You just don't defy the laws of God and get away with it. Sometimes the punishment doesn't come as quickly as it did to Hitler. But before God, it comes. We may consider that there is quite a price to be paid when we give up the doing of something we would like to do for our faith. But believe me, the price that one pays for sin is another thing. I read in a magazine a couple of months ago these words: sin is stupid. Now, this was written by a secular writer. Every time you fudge on your income tax, you let yourself in for years of anxiety, wondering if you will be found out. Every time you cheat on an examination, you rid yourself of the privilege of knowing how good you are. Every time you break a promise, you tear a piece of the world's fabric so that every promise made to you is worth that much less. Even if you don't lose a dime on a broken word, you have lost a part of you, because you are your word. Then we meditate upon this law, because in the long pull, life is richer because of them. C.S. Lewis tells of one little boy who was asked what he thought God was like. His reply was that as far as he could make out, he was the sort of being who's always snooping around to see if anyone is enjoying himself and then trying to stop it. Like the father who said to the maid, "Go and see what Johnny is doing and tell him to stop." These are probably the thoughts that one has so frequently when you read back over Numbers and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and you begin to see how many ways that God has spoken. But as a matter of fact, they're not negative, they're positive things. I used to have great difficulty in the farm running a binder, because binders weren't quite as perfect as they are today, and something was always happening to the cutter, or something was happening to the canvas that was bringing them up, and something was happening to the binder itself that tied it into sheaves. And fortunately, we had a neighbor who was a very good mechanic, and he saved my life many a time. And one day he came over and he stated a piece of philosophy that I have never forgotten. He said, "It's always important to remember that the man who made this blasted machine knew more about it than we do. And before we start messing around, let's look over the book of instructions and see how it is built." Well, it was good counsel. And I've remembered it in so many instances, because life is just like that. The maker of it has given to us a book of instructions, and if we'll just learn the book of instructions, probably we won't get things into such a mess. It's not a negative thing. "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord." It's a joy for him to walk in this way. Notice when Jesus was later asked, "What's the great commandment?" he had the emphasis, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So someone has said, love God and do what you please. So along this route is fullness of life. And the laws are no longer burdens. They're lanterns that are lighting the way to God. And because of that love and that light, our delight is in it. So I suppose it's as good a sentence with which to end a series of sermons on the first Psalm as any other. Love God and do as you please. Amen.
This morning's worship service emanated from Shadyside Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. Ministers of the church are the Reverend Dr. Howard C. Scharfe, the Reverend Dr. James R. Spear, and the Reverend J. Wayne Hanratty. Organist and choir director Russell G. Wickman. Today's sermon by Dr. Scharfe was titled, Meditating on His Law. Your comments on these services are invited. Listen next Sunday at 11 o'clock for the regular worship service from Shadyside Presbyterian Church, Amberson Avenue and Westminster Place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.